Hi, everybody, and welcome to Global Encounters, First Nations Peoples, 1,000 Years of Australian History's seminar program. And it's my absolute delight today because I'm coming from Sydney on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'm up here just for a few days. And as it turns out, so is Natalie, but she's up here permanently. We have Dr. Natali Pearson tonight, who's going to be talking about the amazing shipwreck, the Belitung, and its many lives, both historical and even into the contemporary. We're very grateful, Natalie, that you've made the time to do this for us. We've really enjoyed our our seminar program, which we've been running now for five or more years, and we're planning on creating our own YouTube channel. So you'll be a YouTube star eventually, which I think is a nice way to continue on the resources that a big project like ours has created. So it's my great delight to welcome Dr. Natali Pearson from the University of Sydney. Natalie is an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher awardee, highly competitive, extremely prestigious, very high status position to be in, and we are extremely grateful for you to make the time tonight to give us a lovely talk about one of our favourite shipwrecks, the Belitung. Now, I will disappear so that you don't have to see me as well, and it's over to you to share your screen.
Thank you so much, Lynette. That was such a generous introduction. It's been such a privilege to get to know you, and I'm really honoured to be invited to come and speak to the Global Encounters seminar series tonight. And I would just like to also thank David for his efforts in organising tonight and pulling together the Zoom and all the slides and everything. So without
All right.
any further ado, I'm going to get underway and share my screen. I've got a lot to get through. And really keen to share the story of this shipwreck with you, and also some information about how the story is continuing to evolve. So can you see the
That's
screen here?
perfect.
That's
Perfect.
good.
It's great. It's great. Yeah.
That's perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, my talk today is about encounters of a specific type, encounters at sea. And I'm going to be talking about the Belitung shipwreck. It's spelt Belitung, but actually it's pronounced Belitung. And it's quite interesting to know that this is where Billiton BHP got its start on the island of Belitung, because of all the tin and the tin mining that was taking place on that island. And tin is just one of three remarkable geological features on the island of Belitung, and that is where this shipwreck gets its name. And we will come to the politics of the name of this shipwreck as we go through the talk. Lynette mentioned that she's on Gadigal land. I am too. I live and work on Gadigal land. And I too would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank them for their ongoing custodianship of country. And I extend that respect to First Nations and Indigenous peoples joining us today. So there are an estimated 3 million shipwrecks in the world, according to UNESCO, 3 million ancient shipwrecks. And I'm just going to tell you the story of one of them. It was the focus of my book, which itself was research I conducted for my PhD. And to be honest, when I published the book, I thought that was Belitung done and dusted. And yeah, I moved on to a different research project. I'm looking at World War II shipwrecks now. But the great pleasure of this shipwreck is that its story is continuing to unfold in new ways. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to talk through the discovery and recovery of the wreck and the objects it was carrying, where these objects came from, the origins of the ship, where it was made, where it was travelling to, the sale and the display of the objects, because yes, they were commercially salvaged rather than excavated. And they're now on display, as we'll see, in Singapore at the Asian Civilisations Museum. And that's the crux of my book. But the really valuable, important point I want to draw your attention to here, which we'll come to towards the end of my talk, is the changing legacy of this shipwreck, and how its story continues to unfold in surprising and long overdue ways, that bring attention really back to the communities of Belitung Island, to the living coastal communities still there, still living on Belitung Island today. And I thought it might be useful actually to frame the talk from a heritage perspective, um, because that is my background. That's the perspective I'm bringing to this particular shipwreck. And I wanted to make the point that heritage is not neutral. It's shaped by certain frameworks and by the values and the way we assess the significance of these values. So Laura Jane Smith, who's a very influential Australian scholar, talks about the authorised heritage discourse. And this is a dominant, expert-driven way of deciding what counts as heritage, what gets inscribed. It privileges material objects, monumentality, aesthetics, and national narratives. And it marginalises community meanings and everyday local perspectives. Meanwhile, another Australian scholar, Rodney Harrison, talks about two interrelated understandings of heritage, a largely top-down approach, so official heritage, and then the bottom-up type of heritage. And this is unofficial heritage created and often not captured or categorized anywhere, but it takes place at the local, usually at the local level. So when we look at the Belitung shipwreck, especially this first part of my talk, its discovery, recovery, sale, and display, I just want to make the point that this narrative has largely been driven by that top-down logic. Experts, institutions, UNESCO, museums, governments, and markets deciding what mattered and what story was told. But community voices, local fishers, regional stakeholders, people living with this history and this heritage in their waters are mostly absent from early interpretations of the Belitung shipwreck. But through a long overdue approach, we're starting to see the centering of these living local communities. And the structure of today's talk really does trace that shift from a highly authorised, expert-led narrative towards a more inclusive understanding of what the Belitung might mean. So the first half of the talk, as I said, draws on my work in my book. And the second half is about some of the work that's been done on Belitung Island at the moment, particularly by my outstanding Indonesian colleagues, Nia Ridwan and Zainab Tahir, who are leading this community-centered approach. But let's start with the island. This is Belitung Island, triangulated by Java, Sumatra, and Borneo in the Java Sea. There are many shipwrecks in these waters. You can see the Cirebon, the Intan, which was a 10th century wreck, the Bakau wreck, and then Belitung wreck, just sort of northeast of Belitung Island. So the Belitung shipwreck, as it's called, was found in the late 1990s, we believe. And at that time in Indonesia, commercial salvage was legal with a permit. So there were a number of shipwreck hunters working on Belitung Island to find wrecks using survey permits. And then if and when they found a wreck, they then applied for salvage permits. And one of these shipwreck hunting companies, Seabed Explorations, was working on the Bakau wreck, which you can see to the northeast of the island, when they got news that ceramics had been found about 2 miles northwest of Belitung Island. And so they abandoned the Bakau wreck and went straight to the Belitung wreck to see what was there. And this is what the fishers had pulled up from the sea. This was the reef where jars were growing, as the fishers described it. So it was the late 1990s. A number of shipwrecks were found in these waters, but Belitung is really the one that has, it is one of the most controversial shipwrecks in Southeast Asia, if not the world, and also one of the most historically significant. So they started to pull up these objects from the water and realized that this was going to require a salvage permit. They applied for a salvage permit and permission was given. And the early indication from the objects initially brought to them by the fishers was that these were Chinese ceramics. And this is important because if you look at the date here, 1998, this is the year that Suharto fell from power, the New Order dictator who fell from power in May 1998. And there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and riots, particularly in Jakarta at that time. Jakarta's a long way from Belitung, but the point is there was not a lot of interest in the Indonesian government in what was believed to be perhaps a Chinese shipwreck, or at least it had a lot of Chinese ceramics on board. So they applied for this salvage permit and were given permission to conduct commercial salvage. And there was a lot of pressure to bring up the objects as quickly as possible, not least because of, well, multiple threats, including the monsoon, and the threat of looting as they saw it. So this is the dive boat you can see in the middle here, and they started to bring up dozens, hundreds, thousands of these, mostly ceramics from the seabed. On the right, you can see the anchor. No one knows where that is anymore. And these are two of the sort of lead people in this story of the early days of the recovery of the Belitung. On the right, Tilman Walterfang, who was Director of Seabed Explorations. And on the left, Michael Flecker, who's a name we'll come back to later. He's an Australian based in Singapore, and he was brought on board, literally, in the second season of the Belitung salvage. And a lot of these photos that I'm using today are his. So that's sort of the discovery and recovery. I am moving through this very quickly, and I'm happy to take questions at the end, but I'm conscious of time. So I wanted to turn now to the objects themselves. And what we see is, most of them are these ceramics from the Tang Dynasty. There were estimated to be about 70,000 objects in the cargo of the vessel when it sank, and the majority were ceramics from China. But there are also small quantities of gold, silver, coins, and organics. So if you're not familiar with the underwater environment, it is remarkable actually what can survive underwater, in this case for over 1,000 years. So these were 9th century ceramics, but there were also star anise, seeds, nuts that had survived underwater in dark, anoxic environments for over 1,000 years. So the ceramics in particular showed evidence, spoke to the presence of a well-integrated network of merchants, ceramic producers, and presumably middlemen and people waiting to receive this shipment somewhere else in the world. But most of the ceramics, well, all of the ceramics, bar one or two, or bar four actually, which we'll come to, were from China. And they were from a wide range of kilns. And this is a great map that shows the diversity of the kiln sites, and also, well, the size of the shaded areas is relative to the quantity in the entire ceramic. So what you see is really a lot of ceramics from Changsha. And what's so interesting about these sites, as you can see, they're inland. So we're starting to get a sense of the network of canals and boats used, or different types of transport used to get them to those ports on the coast and to get them onto the ship. So really raising a lot of questions about how all this worked in the 9th century. The largest component, as I've said, was from Changsha, and these were practical everyday vessels. Someone described them, a museum docent described them to me at the Asian Civilisations Museum as like a floating IKEA. But I mean, that was kind of a flippant remark. I enjoyed the levity, but the point is, these were mass produced by individuals, okay? They're not made by machines. There are humans making these, but fast turnaround and very quickly. And there are similarities across many of the Changsha bowls. Some of them are quite individual though, and you can see here a picture of, it's a bit hard to discern if you're not familiar with it, but this is a curly-haired man. You can see his nose and his eyes. So some of them are really quite individual. Excuse me. And I think there were, so we estimated 70,000 objects on the vessel. 60,000 were recovered, so about 10,000 were left on the seabed for various reasons, concretions, or, well, there are various theories about why so many were left on the seabed. But of the 60,000 that were recovered, 57,500 were Changsha, from Changsha, and 55,000 were bowls. So really getting an idea of the mass production here. But there were these remarkable, playful, experimental green and white splashed-ware from Gongxian, including this beautiful ewer, which is over 1 meter tall, and these lovely nose drinking cups, or they've got tubes on the side like a built-in straw. I'm going to move through this very quickly, um, but also these quite astonishing blue and white. And the reason these are astonishing is because they date to the 9th century. And China's ceramics, the most famous ceramics are the Jingdezhen blue and white from the 14th century. But these three sources or stoneware sources predate that by 5 centuries. And what we have here is like a prototype using materials from Central Asia, like the cobalt, fired using Chinese clay in China, and then being sent back, we believe, to the Middle East as a sort of prototype. And I didn't really talk about it too much here, but you can see a bit of the detail of the ewer, these lozenges, some of the pseudo calligraphy on these juncture bowls have led to the scholarly conclusion, or many scholars to believe that the vessel was bound for the Middle East when it sank, and that was the ultimate destination and market for these 70,000 objects. Also beautiful whiteware from Jing or Ding, compared to silver and snow. There weren't many of these, about 300 objects, but these are very, very fine and highly valued. Whereas the Changsha was like the floating IKEA, these were extremely valued in China as well. So raising questions about why they were on this mass market shipment. And again, the green stoneware is the Celadon from Yue. Whereas the Jing and Ding were white as snow, these are considered as pure as jade. And there's been some very interesting scholarship about their role in Chinese tea ceremonies. Now, I won't go into too much detail about the other objects, but as I said, the gold, this is an astonishing octagonal cup. Nothing like this has ever been found in the sea or outside China. So I think only one other type of cup, one other cup like this has ever been found in China in a tomb. So the bearded men feature on the thumb ring of the cup, and around the cup itself we have Central Asian dancers and musicians, and we can determine that by the types of instruments that they're playing. There was also some silver, very expensive to conserve. I understand this one cost like $30,000 to conserve. So this is a silver wine flask, and there's the repeat appearance. You can see here possibly the two mandarin ducks. And there were also, I think maybe you can see on some of the gold as well, some of the images or typologies suggest that some of this might have been part of a wedding gift, but that is speculation. We really do not know. A lot of silver bullion was also found on the wreck, coins which help to date the wreck. So we can pretty firmly say that the wreck was, the ship was traveling in the second quarter of the 9th century, so around, I think, 826. It was also carrying a number of mirrors. One of them was from the Han Dynasty, so it was already an antique at the time the ship sailed. And as I said, some of these organics, so star anise, amber, resin, nuts, and canarium seeds. Now, that is the cargo. But what I thought I would also just touch on or share with you is the domestic assemblage. So the cargo, the changsha bowls, the lozenges on the gongxian green and splashed ceramics, they tell us that the ship was destined for the Middle East. But what about the people who were on the ship itself? What about the crew? Were there any passengers? What do we know of the people involved in this story? We've got a sense of the people producing en masse these ceramics in China, shipping them down the canals off to the ports, onto the boat. We don't really know where the boat loaded. Did it load at a single port? Did it visit multiple ports in China? Did it collect its cargo from an entrepot in Southeast Asia? We don't know the answers. But some of the domestic assemblage on the vessel, on the wreck, does give us little glimpses into what life was like on board, and, the sort of people who might have been on board. So here I've got, well, we see objects from China, this beautiful bone die, Southeast Asia, and also the Middle East. The dog figurine here, might have been a paperweight. There was also a bird-shaped stoneware whistle, and these were the only two animal figurines found. And perhaps they were personal keepsakes, unlikely to be objects of trade. And then we see these game pieces in the form of acorns, hinting at long days at sea and how they might have passed the time. Very intriguingly, at the bottom left here, we have an inkstone from China, engraved with an insect that almost certainly belonged to a literate Chinese merchant, who might have been a passenger rather than a crew member, but we don't know. The bronze needle suggests work. It might have been used for repair for the sails, of which there was no trace. And the gold bracelet is interesting because it shows signs of having been repaired. So it's unlikely to have been part of that gold that was being either gifted or traded that I showed you earlier. And we also have these objects are all from Southeast Asia, associated with measuring weights and scales. So really a very interesting assemblage. I'm just going to show you these four. So I mentioned there were four objects that were not from China, not from Southeast Asia, and it is these ones. These are from the Middle East. Three turquoise glazed amphora and a glass bottle. So the amphora were widely exported and might have been used as storage containers for liquids in this case, like date syrup or perhaps water. And they have been found throughout Asia, including in the Bujang Valley in Malaysia and in China. And the glass jar, meanwhile, might have contained medicine or cosmetics, glass being commonly associated and produced with the Islamic Middle East in the 9th century. So there was this very unique cargo, the commercial objects, the domestic assemblage, really begging the question of where was the ship from? Where had it been constructed? We have ideas about where it was going to, but what trade routes and networks was it connecting? And how can we understand these better by trying to understand the origin of the ship? So the ship itself is actually a marvel. The vessel was it's commonly described as a sewn ship stitched together, but I have it on very good authority that sewn is not the correct terminology, and actually the best way to describe it is lacing, because the holes were already punched in the side in the planks, and then using young coconut fibers sewn together, double stitched inside and outside with wadding and cordage, and rendered with some type of animal fat, perhaps goat fat. So when they did a reconstruction, which they did, I'll go to that slide now, the people who worked on that reconstruction talked about how stinky the ship was once they'd rendered it with goat fat. But this particular type of ship construction, the stitched hull or the sewn hull, the laced hull, as I'm trying to say, is typically associated with the Western Indian Ocean. So they conducted timber analysis, and it was a bit inconclusive, to be honest. Initially, the first round of analysis suggested that everything came from India, and then they did more analysis, and the results were completely different. So this is a technique commonly associated with the Western Indian Ocean. So Oman, Yemen, around the Middle East. But the Belitung shipwreck is often described as Omani in origin. We don't know that for sure because not enough archaeological documentation was conducted on the ship. The analysis of the timber is very inconclusive, but Oman was the country that heard about this remarkable discovery and funded a replica. And so what you see on the screen here is the Jewel of Muscat. So it was a reconstruction done in 2010, highly documented. There's a link there to the jewelofmuscat.tv if you want to get your nerd on and go and have a look at all the incredible techniques that they used to reconstruct this vessel. And then they sailed it across the Indian Ocean in 2010 to Singapore, and we'll come to the reasons why they gave it to Singapore in a moment, on the anniversary of diplomatic ties. So the narrative has been that it's from Oman, or at least it's from the Western Indian Ocean, but there's been a remarkable discovery in 2013 in Thailand, the Panom Surin sewn or laced ship. Similar vintage, 9th or 10th century. What is interesting about this ship is it's almost identical in its structure, its construction, technique to the Belitung. So they're considered sister ships. One is slightly larger than the other, but otherwise very, very similar. And the timber analysis on this ship, the one found in Thailand, is conclusive and everything is Southeast Asian. So that raises a lot of questions about the Belitung, because they did find that some of the wadding and the cordage on the Belitung was from species that can be found in Southeast Asia. So it raises the question, maybe the Belitung shipwreck was made closer to Southeast Asia than we've initially believed, and not made in the Western Indian Ocean and sailed across the Indian Ocean to China or to Sumatra to collect its cargo. So this is a question we don't have the answer to about the origin of Belitung shipwreck, but certainly a very intriguing aspect of scholarship for maritime archaeologists in particular, who hopefully will be able to keep conducting research and finding out more about Panom Surin and illuminating what we know about Belitung in the process. Now, I mentioned we'd come to Singapore. And Singapore enters the story because once these 60,000 odd objects were pulled from the ocean, they were conserved, most of them in New Zealand, and then the bidding began. They were for sale. It was a commercial arrangement. Now, under Indonesia's legislation at the time, it was completely legal to sell these objects. However, the legislation provided for a 50-50 split between the Indonesian government and the salvage company, Seabed Explorations. But as I said, the salvage company had been working on a number of other ships in the region at the time. The Bacau, they didn't find much there, not much they could sell anyway. But they also had the Intan. They had salvaged the Intan, the 10th century Intan. So some discussions were had and some arrangements were reached. And the Indonesian government, through their shipwreck committee, agreed to allow the commercial salvage company to retain all of the Belitung objects in exchange for the Indonesian government retaining all of the Intan objects, plus a $2 million sweetener. And I think the reasoning here was that the Intan was conceived of or sold as a ship more relevant to Indonesia, which I think is super interesting. I mean, there were a lot of there's a great diversity of objects on Intan, and many of them from Indonesia or clearly being traded within the archipelago. And I think the Belitung was seen as an Arab ship, an Arab dhow, as they're often called, with Chinese ceramics, and no connection to Indonesia at all. So perhaps that is why this arrangement was reached, whereby the Seabed Exploration Salvage Company was able to retain all of the objects that they'd salvaged, which was, contrary to what the law provided for, but an indication of just how slippery and ambiguous Indonesian law was regarding shipwreck salvage. And I have to say, that legislation has continued to evolve. There was a moratorium on commercial salvage for a number of years, but recently that moratorium has been overturned and shipwreck legislation in Indonesia is more complicated than ever. So what happened to Belitung was a product of its time, but it is certainly not a resolved issue, the management of underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia. So Belitung goes on the market. There are different options available to Seabed Explorations. Do they allow cherry picking, that gold cup, that Gongxian 1 meter ewer, or do they try to sell it as a single collection? Tilman Walter Fang has always stated that he wanted to sell it as a single collection because it retained the historic and archaeological qualities better together. It also had more economic value as a single collection, to be honest, because the Changsha bowls, if you split them up, going back to that IKEA comment, they're not worth much as single items. Their value is together. And certainly that is the perspective from archaeologists. So the initial asking price was $48 million US as a single assemblage. And there was interest from all over the world. art dealers, auction houses, private collectors who wanted individual pieces, but also museums, national governments, including Shanghai Museum, Qatar, and the Singapore government, who were all interested in this shipwreck. Now, ultimately, Singapore was a successful bidder, excuse me, and they wanted to purchase it to fill their new public maritime museum. They got a bit of a cut from the initial asking price. They managed to purchase it in 2005 for US $32 million, rather than the initial $48 million. And what I want to point out to you here is that it was purchased by a subsidiary of the Singapore government, specifically a subsidiary of the Tourism Board. So it's not the National Heritage Board, it's the Tourism Board. And these objects were intended to fill the museum and to be used to tell the story of Singapore as the centre of Southeast Asian and global maritime histories. So the objects, once they were purchased by Singapore, were renamed. They were renamed the Tang Shipwreck Collection. So this is a more Pan-Asian name. It centres it more within speaking to the maritime Silk Route, to China, to Singapore's relationship with the region. Whereas few people would have heard of Belitung Island in Singapore at the time. Certainly, Tang was a name that most people would recognise. But how did it fit into the Singapore story? What was its connection with Singapore? Very little, to be honest, other than Singapore was the purchaser. And then the question of how to make 50,000 stoneware bowls interesting. Now, I've put it in scare quotes because I find these bowls extremely interesting and beautiful, and there's so much to learn from them. And indeed, scholars have done so much great research analysing these bowls in their entirety, the assemblage in its entirety. But for a curator, displaying what are small brown bowls poses a challenge, or at least it was considered to pose a challenge for Singapore and how to relate it back to the Singapore story. So this is what Singapore got. Now, I said 60,000 objects had been recovered from the ocean. Singapore's collection totaled 53,000. Sorry, there's a double there. It's only just one side of the screen you should be looking at. So there's a question around what happened to the other 7,000 objects that were salvaged. And I'll just put that out there. But we'll come back to that question of what Singapore's relationship was with the objects. And Rachel Lowe, who's a historian, really nailed it with this analysis. She talked about Singapore's central place at the elbow of a great oceanic route, running parallel to the overland Silk Road, and speaking to Singapore's self-image as a global maritime entrepot and the lodestone on which Southeast Asia turns. So I'm just going to have a quick detour here to take you back to the Jewel of Muscat, because remember I said in 2010 it had sailed from Oman to Singapore. So Singapore had the objects for 5 years by that time, and this is where it ended up. It is on display at the Maritime Experiential Museum on Sentosa Island, with no connection to the objects themselves. We'll come back to so that photo was taken in 2017, and the vessel and its interpretation and its context continues to change, but it remains very much separated from the objects that Singapore had purchased and renamed the Tang Shipwreck Collection, which I think is a great shame to not be able to make that connection with this ship. And to think about how the objects would have fitted on this, where the crew lived, because the crew lived on top of the objects. There was no, cabins down below. So it's a real missed opportunity. So look, very quickly, Singapore partnered with the Smithsonian, and they had visions for a grand international travelling exhibition. But there was a lot of attention in America about the ethical question by which these objects had come to be surfaced. It was legal, but was it ethical? And there was a mounting criticism in America. And ultimately, the Smithsonian pulled the pin on the International Travelling Exhibition and left Singapore with what I've called a white elephant. They've spent $32 million on these objects. They're not really related to Singapore. And now with the Smithsonian's cancellation, who on earth is going to want to show this international travelling exhibition? So Singapore pivoted. They positioned themselves by putting them on permanent display at the Asian Civilisations Museum. And I know some of you in the audience have had the privilege of visiting them and seeing them on display. This photo was taken maybe 5 or 10 years ago. There's many more bowls on display now. And because they have so many bowls in the collection, you can see they've used them as this beautiful wave. They're sort of on traditional museum display here for the more unique ones. And then they're also displayed in a large storage jar as they're believed to have been shipped. So many different creative ways of displaying these 55,000 odd Changsha bowls. Eventually, Singapore did find some international partners willing to display the objects, and they have gone on tour around the world under different names since the Smithsonian cancelled that shipwrecked exhibition. So they went to Canada, to an Islamic museum, the Aga Khan Museum in 2014, 2015. And you can see some of them are on display here at the Changsha Kiln in China. Now, these are not part of the Tang Shipwreck collection. These have been purchased privately by the Changsha Museum, and there is still the question of many of these objects not being accounted for and popping up in private collections. And you can see a bit of a summary here on the left. I mentioned those 7,000 objects that are missing. So they're in the Shipwreck Artifact Warehouse in Chulungsi in West Java. And these objects are, and this is a quote from my book actually, we're talking about orphaned objects. They're legal, but are they ethical? How did they come to be in the world? What is their provenance? And what do we do with them now that we've got in Singapore 53,000 and in Chulungsi in the Shipwreck Artifact Warehouse, we've got 7,000, and many of them keep popping up in private collections. So this is where I thought my book had finished, the question about the museological dilemma. Do museums put them on display and leave it to the public to decide if this is ethical or not? How much information do museums give to the public? Do they just focus on the art historical questions, or do they really interrogate the provenance questions? And or do they not put the objects on display at all? Do they throw them back in the water? What rights and responsibilities do museums have to the objects and to the public? So this is where I thought my book had finished, right? And my involvement with Belitung. But as I said, the legacy keeps changing, and it's an absolute delight to watch that changing legacy. So I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes talking about this changing legacy and hopefully finish right on time. So I'm just going to come back to thinking about heritage. Heritage as a verb, as a process, rather than as a noun, and our changing understanding of heritage as something that is relational, overlapping, and most importantly, co-produced and co-created by people, places, and their environments. And coming back to Laura Jane Smith, she draws our attention to the political dynamics of heritage and its relationship with individual and group identity, and with sense of place and belonging. And it has power in its ability to speak to these identities, to be a place where these identities can come together and express themselves, or also overshadowing or marginalizing or not allowing these individual expressions of identity to come together. So the changing legacies, as I see them, there are changing legacies for Singapore. There are changing legacies for the Jewel of Muscat. So we'll see what's happened to that one. And for our understanding of the objects, for these orphaned objects, and most importantly, for the communities of Belitung Island. So Singapore, Michael Flecker is still working there, still based there. And for the past few years, he's been working on these two shipwrecks. Finally, they found some shipwrecks of their own in Singapore. Although that's slightly disputed because I think they're in Malaysian territory, or disputed Malaysian Singaporean territory. So these are a bit controversial, but anyway, these are, considered Singapore's shipwrecks. Not going to dwell on that for too long. I want to show the Jewel of Muscat. So thanks to Zainab for these amazing photos of the Jewel of Muscat, still inside the Maritime Experiential Museum, which has been renamed the Singapore Oceanarium. Very much focused on the aquarium aspects of the venue. And it's near a soft play area, near a cafe, and still no reference to the objects in the ACM. And I think that middle bottom is, I think, the only interpretive signage on display. So anyway, it's very limited and um, yeah, a bit sad actually. Um, there are still objects in private collections, of course, still popping up. So this one on the left was published in a magazine in 2021. Isn't it astonishing? So that's a Changsha bowl with a Makara sea monster jumping out of the ocean and about to, I don't know, gobble down this vessel with, I think, flying fish. Just an astonishing, but that's in a private collection. That is from Belitung Shipwreck. And then, the ones on the right, we don't know if they're from Belitung or not. They certainly are concreted, suggesting they've been underwater, and they do have that same Changsha style. So there's many, many examples I could show you of the private collections, but I'm also conscious of not breaching confidentiality of those people who do have them in their collections. And this brings us to the question of the orphaned objects, right? Which the cultural objects that have been recovered unethically or illegally or in some other problematic way. So in this case with Belitung, those objects that have been commercially salvaged rather than scientifically excavated. And it leaves us with the question of how to manage these huge volumes of orphaned objects. It's not just Belitung objects, but many other shipwrecks in Indonesia and across other, parts of Southeast Asia. So I wanted to talk to you about very briefly some of the projects that have emerged, trying to address how to manage, how to wrestle with, how to interpret these orphaned objects. The first was this COVID online workshop where I was able to work with Zainab for the first time, who I met at Jakarta's Marine Heritage Gallery, and get some students working through site visits on some of the objects from Belitung and other objects in the shipwreck artifact warehouse. That was a really great project. It was only small, but it was the first time I had the opportunity to work with Zainab and the beginning of a very productive relationship. Most recently, we've done some work with the Australia ASEAN Council on the Sea Collections project. I thought we were very clever coming up with that, sea being ocean and sea being Southeast Asia. So there's an online exhibition. We did a lot of work with museums across Southeast Asia, one of which was the Marine Heritage Gallery in Jakarta, and one of the Changsha bowls was chosen to be featured as part of that online exhibition. But really the big project is this Reuniting Orphaned Cargoes project, which has been funded through a linkage. You can see the chief investigator, Martin Polkinghorne, here at the SeaCal laboratory at Flinders University, together with Zainab and Nia, bringing together two collections, private collection of very diverse objects collected by private collector Michael Abbott, into conversation with the objects at the Shipwreck Artifact Warehouse. And this is where the community-centred work has come through. And I'm going to wrap up here by talking about these community-centred approaches. So via this Reuniting Orphaned Cargoes project, the research team has been able to visit Belitung Island, and Nia and Zainab, as the PhD candidates on the project, have been conducting fieldwork with local communities to resurface the stories of the communities and their relationship with the wreck and, what happened back in the late 1990s. And this is the sort of meaningful community-centred work that overturns existing heritage discourses by recentering local narratives and challenging dominant institutional, economic, so-called expert-led framings of heritage. And I was so privileged to accompany some of the Reuniting Orphaned Cargoes team last year to Belitung, and to see the work that is being done by Nia and Zainab with the people on Belitung Island. This involved visiting the local museum. This is the only vitrine showing objects from Belitung. So on the whole island, this is all that was available as a legacy of this remarkable shipwreck in their waters. But what's happening is the community is re-embracing their maritime heritage and revitalising it through creative industries, through this annual Maritime Heritage Festival. There's a whole dance about a shipwreck. I mean, it was absolutely stunning. And we are starting to see interpretive displays in the local village office, again, through the Reuniting Orphaned Cargoes project, working together with local government officials here at the Batu Itam village office. And this is the community most connected to the wreck, Batu Itam, black rock. That is another one of the outstanding geological features on this island, the black granite rocks. And the Batu Itam community is the one who's really reclaiming their maritime heritage. So You can see I'm wearing this spectacular batik, which, if you look closely, has ships and ceramics on it. And this has been run by Similia Batik in Belitung Island. Really creative industries revitalizing maritime heritage through the batik, through these amazing woodblock carvings created by Pak Mansur, who's a really experienced artist and is doing this beautiful work. You can see some of his interpretations of the discovery and the ship here, and on display at the Maritime Heritage Festival. Bika Ceramics Workshop, just gorgeous. So you don't need to go and buy a 9th century changsha bowl off eBay, and please do not do that. Bika is making the most beautiful interpretations of these objects, and stimulating community creativity and income in the process. And finally, UNESCO, which has played an important role in mapping cultural resources on the island and supporting this creative economic capacity. And the idea is to support sustainable heritage-based livelihoods that continue to contribute to Indonesia's underwater cultural heritage. And I just wanted to point out that the involvement of UNESCO, which is, so valuable, is also connected to Nia's PhD research. So her methods and approach include not just archaeological survey and excavation, but also this community engagement, participatory action research, really involving the community and other stakeholders like UNESCO Jakarta. So to wrap up, looking forward, these are the black rocks, these are the batu hitam, and I talked about the politics of naming. So Singapore called it Tang, and it's on display there as Tang. My book calls it Belitung. But since visiting Belitung Island, I really think I need to rename my book Batu Hitam, because that is the name by which this shipwreck is known in the local community. And Tang and Belitung, as a name, really reflect the sort of institutional authorised heritage discourse approach that has informed the work on this shipwreck thus far. And I think we can also reframe heritage, thinking about whether it's from above or below, and rethinking who are the experts, is it the museums, or is it the people who live with the objects in the waters and have this deep knowledge of maritime life, maritime cultural landscapes, what it's like to live on this island. And then finally, reclaiming. So the role of these coastal communities, working towards a more sustainable approach to maritime heritage that doesn't involve commercial salvage, fostering livelihoods, and ultimately, supporting more sustainable approaches. And I did want to mention that there will be more research from the Reuniting Orphaned Cargoes project related to the community work released soon. We've got, obviously Nia and Zainab will finish their PhDs next year, and we've got a special issue of historical archaeology coming out called Beyond the Belitung, and many other research outputs associated with the project. So my last slide is my book. But I feel like it's got the wrong title. But anyway, now you understand why I'm rethinking the title of my book and the important work that is still to be done in thinking about the afterlives of this particular shipwreck. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Where am I? That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And what extraordinary timing. That was incredible.
Oh, good.
Well done. Very
Good.
well
Thank
done.
you.
So, look, we open up the floor for anybody who would like to ask questions. Please put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. I can't actually see people for some reason, but I can. Rosalie Trioli is saying fascinating. So thank you, Rosalie.
Thanks,
Lovely to see
Rosalie.
you here tonight.
Mm.
If people could, because I'm here and I'm working on a laptop, which is a little different to what I'm normally doing, I can't actually see everybody. So if people could pop their hand up, I think you will appear on my screen. So
Mm.
okay. Ian McNiven has said, thank you. Great talk, Natalie. Has any evidence of ritual voyaging practices been recovered from the Belitung wreck, such as deity figurines, offering incense bowls, and so on? And there's Ian
Uh,
McNiven up in the corner.
Thanks, Ian. I saw you've got a chapter on ritual in your new book, which I have not read, but congratulations. Um, I think one of my slides had an incense burner, a celadon, but I believe that was part of the trade cargo. And there was also a symbol. I think it was bronze, and that might have been for music or it might have been for ritual. But we don't know, or I don't know. I'm not aware of any deity figurines or offering or incense balls that were not part of that trade cargo on Belitung. Part of that might be, because they simply weren't found or because the data wasn't collected. So I guess I leave that question unanswered, just acknowledging that we don't have all the information, or we don't have as much information as we could have had it been excavated like the Mary Rose was over, decades instead of two short salvage seasons. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions still remaining about the shipwreck, so I'm not able to answer that.
Okay.
Excellent.
Hmm.
That's a good segue, perhaps, to discuss the technique of the excavation. Did they leave behind lots of detailed notes, or was it just we went in and dug it out?
Yeah, so that's a good and I use the word commercial salvage very carefully, not
Mhm.
excavation, because it was fast. It was described by the salvage company as a recovery operation. The monsoon was arriving and they were under pressure to get the objects out before the first monsoon. Ultimately, they didn't achieve that and they had to come back for a second season, and objects were looted in between salvage seasons. There was a change of personnel that I alluded to. Michael Flecker was brought on in the second season. Um, he says that he documented as much as he could, and um, he some of his documentation was used to inform the construction of the Jewel of Muscat, using other evidence as well. But I mean, they didn't find information about the masts or the sails. They don't know what the sails look like on Belitung. And the hull was left, I mean, that's a crucial piece of information, right?
Mm.
If it had been excavated, we would have answers to many of these questions, I suspect. But it was a condition of the salvage permit by the Indonesian government that the hull would be left in situ to promote tourism. That never eventuated because, first of all, it was timber and it was destroyed by teredo worm once oxygen and light were introduced to the site, but also because of the looting that took place, particularly when the salvage had finished. And people came to the site to see what was left over. And then there were many, about 10,000 objects, the pane ballast, the lead, some of the silver objects that were concreted, and quite possibly objects that were broken and had less commercial value than the intact objects. These are all highly controversial questions, but someone described it to me recently as the original sin of the Belitung is the method by which it was brought up. So
Yeah.
it was certainly not an archaeological excavation of a sort that maritime archaeologists, would recognize.
So with the exhibition, I mean, it's a really innovative exhibition at
Mm.
the Asian Civilisations Museum, and I think just the undulating way that they use these sort of acrylic
Yeah, the
mounts and things. I
bowls.
think it's
Yeah.
actually really beautiful.
Mm.
Uh, how much input into that did archaeologists have?
Well, the curator at the time, Stephen Murphy, is he's trained in art history and archaeology, not underwater. But he didn't really have any knowledge or experience with this particular shipwreck when it landed on his desk, so to speak. I think when it originally went on display, there was quite a bit of criticism at the lack of information around the provenance of the objects. There was too much focus on the art history. And I'm not pointing the finger at Stephen by any means. I mean, this was an institutional approach. And the display has changed over the years. There is more information now about the context, the Indonesian origins. I mean, when it first went on display, there was sort of no mention of Indonesia, or very little mention that this shipwreck had been found there. It was very much a civilizational narrative of Tang Dynasty China, Abbasid, empire in the Middle East, and Singapore right in the middle. It's changed. It's more nuanced now. But I mentioned that special issue that's coming out next year, and I'm thrilled that Stephen has contributed to that, and he's written a piece reflecting on the challenges of curating this exhibition. So that's one to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'll definitely look out for that.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Any, because I've got a couple more that I might ask if doesn't look like I can see anybody at the moment.
Oh,
I'm
yeah, Ian's asked one.
Ian's asked one, yes.
Any
Whispers of
whispers of
human
human
remains.
remains? No. Look, they might have been able to swim to shore. It's about two nautical miles, if they were good swimmers. But no, no human remains and no silk, right? And part of the story, the Maritime Silk Road, no silk was found on this shipwreck, and no bones either, no animal bones. So yeah,
Do you
thanks,
think that
Ian.
the lack of silk is the result of
I
the
I don't know if
preservation?
silk was on the cargo.
Yeah,
No.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry,
Um,
did you have another
yeah,
question?
I did have a question. I'm completely fascinated, and I have absolutely, as I said, I'm determined to go to that Maritime
Maritime
Festival in
Heritage Festival.
Belitung
Yeah.
next year. It's on my list. I'm fascinated by how that community is now embracing their shipwreck.
Yeah.
It's their
I know.
ship.
It's amazing.
Really interesting stuff. Do
Yeah.
you write about that as well in this special edition journal?
Yeah. Yeah. They're like the core articles of the special issue. And
Great.
they've been written by the two PhD candidates doing that work.
Fantastic.
So yeah, there's a lot more information and detail in there about the results of the fieldwork that's been done, some fabulous interviews, and really interesting data collection and insights. And it has been such a privilege for me to see this story being taken in this direction. It's just so overdue.
Amazing.
Yeah, beyond these institutional approaches, and this is a thriving community with lots of opinions, lots of energy, lots of ideas, and to go and see what they're doing is super exciting. So
Mm.
I really credit Nia and Zainab and their approach to working with this community together with their local partners in Belitung and the Ministry of Marine Affairs in particular. So yeah,
Fabulous.
I hope you can come to that Maritime Heritage Festival
Definitely.
and
Wendy twisted my arm, so I can see Wendy's in the
Well, you can get
audience
one of
too.
these beautiful batik when you go there as well.
Thank you. So, and lovely to see, at least see that you're on the screen. So, um, I think we're getting very, very close to our finish.
Yeah.
David will pop up our last slide. It
Okay.
leaves it to me to say thank you so much, Natalie. This has been an
Thank
absolute
you.
thrill, a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it very
Thank
much.
you for having me. Thank you so
And
much.
really enjoyed it a great deal. So thank you.
Thank
Um,
you.
this is just to remind everybody that we have two more seminars. Well, we've got a few more things to happen. If anyone's still in Perth, you've got until the 29th. You've got another 10 days to see the Awakening Histories exhibition. Our good friend and colleague Arby is heading over there next week. So he actually gets there, I believe, on the day that it closes. So he's one of our he was also on the curatorium with us. So anyone in Perth, I do recommend that to you. Our next seminar in April is going to be Dr. Leonie Stevens, who's going to be well, in a sense, it's going to be a bit of a soft launch for a monumental piece of work that comes out of our project that Leonie has been driving this part of it, looking out and looking in coastal encounters between First Nations peoples and those who came from the sea. And it's a kind of, uh, it's a massive digest of all those first contact moments when people arrived from the sea and encountered. And we're trying very hard to make it so that you can see what the response of Aboriginal people was, or Torres Strait Islanders indeed, and what the response of the Europeans or the indeed Indonesians were. So that's in April. Then we're heading off to Makassar for the Makassar International Writers Festival. We'll be doing a discussion there, and we're also using that as an opportunity to give back to a number of our friends and colleagues and universities that have been working with us over the last few years. So that's a real opportunity there. And then in May, Professor Ian McNiven is going to do also a bit of a soft launch, Sentient Seas, the Archaeology of Seascapes and Maritime Rituals, his new book that has just been published, which appears to be, everyone seems to have access to a copy of except him. So hopefully the box of books will have turned up by then. So thank you, everybody. That takes us up to 7 o'clock. Marvelous to see you, Natalie. Thank you. I
Thanks
really
so
look
much
forward
again.
to our trip to Belitung next year.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye,
so much,
everyone.
Natalie.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, David. Thanks again. Bye, Leonie.
Thank you.
See ya.